everyone. In this video recording, we're going to cover muscle tissues and do an overview of this tissue. And muscles, they're like these well-oiled machines that are going to work over time, and they're also going to be made up of wires and cables and these energy sources and levers. And in fact, our whole body is this machine that's made up of several parts, which are the organ systems. And among those parts, we do have the muscular system, which is what we're going to be talking about, and that will function to move body parts, and it can be either voluntary or involuntary, and we're going to talk about this today. And this means that you either have control over this movement or you do not have control over the movement. So voluntary means that you have control, and involuntary means that you do not have control. One essential component of the machinery that we were talking about of the human body is the muscular tissue, and the muscular tissue will weigh between 40 to 50% of the total body mass. Of course, this depends on the percentage of body fat, gender, and also the amount of exercise that you do. But most of the work that's going to be done by the body, such as the ones that are listed here, like pumping blood through the blood vessels, eating, breathing, speaking, standing up straight, or getting our skeletons to move, and even moving the food through the gastrointestinal tract, or moving urine out of the urinary bladder, or generating heat. All of these are results of the activity of the muscles. And in this module, we will learn how the simple parts of your muscular machinery work together to produce this very powerful contractile forces that are going to generate most of the activity of the human body. As we have learned in Module 2, there are 3 types of muscular tissue. We're going to have the skeletal, the cardiac, and the smooth muscles. Myology, where myo means muscle and logy means study of, is the scientific study of the structure, the function, and the diseases of all muscle types. And although the 3 types of muscular tissue share some properties, they will differ from one another in their microscopic anatomy, their location, and how they are controlled by the nervous system and also the endocrine system. Here we're first going to cover the skeletal muscle tissue, which is what we're going to focus more on this module. And the skeletal muscle tissue, it receives this name because the function of most skeletal muscles is to move the bones of the skeleton. So that's why it's called the skeletal muscle tissue. There are going to be a few that will attach to structures other than the bone, such as the ones that attach to the skin or even other skeletal muscles. And we're going to see when we talk about axial and appendicular musculature, how these will insert on the skin or on the bone or even on other muscles. But the skeletal muscle tissue works primarily in a voluntary manner, meaning that its activity can be consciously controlled. Therefore, it's voluntary. You think about it and you voluntarily do it. Differences among the 3 types of muscles are going to include this microscopic organization of the contractile proteins, which are actin and myosin. So all muscle tissue types, they do have actin and myosin. However, the way that they are arranged is what's going to give one of the characteristics of the different types of tissue. Now, in the skeletal muscle, the actin and the myosin proteins, they're going to be arranged very regularly in the cytoplasm of these individual muscle cells. Now, the muscle cells can also be referred to as fibers. And this arrangement that's very organized is present both in the skeletal muscle and in the cardiac muscle, which is going to create this pattern of stripes that we can see over here that are called striations. So the striations are going to be present here, as we can see in the skeletal muscle tissue, and also in the cardiac muscle, which is the next slide. Now, the striations are going to be visible with a light microscope under high magnification, as we can see here on this image to the left. In addition, the skeletal muscle fibers, they're going to have several nuclei. So we say that they're multinucleated. And from this image, we can see how the nuclei are going to be arranged on the periphery of the muscle cell tissue. Here we have the cardiac muscle tissue, and like the name says, it's only going to be found in the heart, where it's going to form most of the heart wall. Now, cardiac muscle fibers each have 1 to 2 nuclei, and contrary to the skeletal muscle tissue that we saw on the previous slide, these are going to be located more centrally instead of the periphery of the muscle fiber as we saw in the skeletal muscle. So the cardiac nuclei are going to be located more centrally. Like the skeletal muscle, the cardiac muscle is also going to be striated, as we can see over here. However, the action of this muscle tissue is going to be involuntary. So it means that you are not going to be able to control when your heart beats, which is great, right? So we don't even have to think about our heart beating and making it beat because it will beat by itself. Now, why does the heart beat by itself? Well, it beats because it has a natural pacemaker that will initiate each contraction. And this built-in or intrinsic rhythm is called autorhythmicity. And several hormones and neurotransmitters, they're going to adjust the heart rate by speeding it up or slowing it down, which is also something that we do not have control over. Of course, there are certain things that you can do to try to regulate your heartbeat when you're very anxious, for example, and your heart is beating fast. Then there are certain mechanisms that you can use to try to adjust the heartbeat. But it's something that you have to work on to make sure that you understand how your body works. And as you can imagine, it takes a lot of time to understand this process. Now, due to the fact that the heart is in constant movement as it beats on average about 60 to 100 beats per minute, these cardiac cells, which are also called cardiomyocytes, they need to be tightly together, and this is done by the presence of these structures that are called intercalated discs, as we can see them over here on the image. And in these structures, we will also find desmosomes. Remember how they were a type of cell junction in addition to gap junctions, which create this communication from one cell to the other. Now, this means that once a cell receives a signal to beat faster or slower, for example, all other cells will receive the same message through these gap junctions. Therefore, they will all be together, and there we have the autorhythmicity again. In addition, we can see how these cells are going to be branching out to be able to increase the connection between them. So we say that these cells are branched. Here we are going to be talking about the smooth muscle tissue, which is located in the walls of these hollow internal structures, such as blood vessels, airways, and most organs in your abdominal pelvic cavity. Now, smooth muscle tissue, it gets its name from the fact that under a microscope, it appears non-striated, so it doesn't have the striation as the skeletal muscles do and the cardiac muscle do, and it appears smooth. So that's why it's called the smooth muscle. Now, the action of the smooth muscle is usually involuntary, and like the cardiac muscle, some smooth muscle tissue has the autorhythmicity that we talked about, such as the muscles that are going to propel the food through the gastrointestinal tract, because we don't have to think about the food going down our digestive tract. Now, both the cardiac muscle and the smooth muscle are going to be regulated by neurons that are part of the autonomic nervous system, which is a division that's going to be involuntary, and also by hormones that are going to be released by the endocrine glands. It does have a single central nucleus, as we can see over here. In addition to the locations that we talked about where we're going to find the smooth muscle tissue, it is also attached to hair follicles in the skin, meaning that when we get goosebumps and our hair stands up, this is a smooth muscle. We can see it on this image, and it's called the erector pili muscle, always associated with the hair follicle. And the name describes exactly what it does. It erects or elevates the pili, which is the hair. Just don't get confused that even though this muscle erects the hair, pay attention to how the term is spelled with an A instead of an E. In humans, it is important because it closes the pores and prevents the heat from leaving the body. So when we're cold, that's why we get goosebumps, to try to keep most of the heat in the body. In terms of other mammals in general, it is going to serve as this defense mechanism. If you have pets, you guys know exactly what I am talking about, right? And the reason why dogs' hairs, for example, lift when they feel threatened is that when their hair is sticking up, it makes them look bigger and therefore more aggressive. And this way, they try to scare the other animal or whatever is making them feel threatened. With regards to the contractile proteins, I said already that it will be the same as the skeletal and the cardiac muscles, as they will contain myosin and actin, and we will definitely talk more about this muscle when we get to the digestive system. But for now, we will focus on the skeletal muscles. Muscles in general, they have 4 special properties that will enable it to function and also to contribute to homeostasis. And they are listed here. We're going to have the electrical excitability, contractility, extensibility, and elasticity. Let's talk first about the electrical excitability, which is going to be a property of both neurons and muscle cells. And like the name says, electrical, therefore it will be the ability of a muscle fiber to respond to certain stimuli by producing an action potential. For muscle cells, 2 main types of stimuli will trigger an action potential. It can either be a chemical or an electrical stimuli. An example of a chemical can be the release of a neurotransmitter by neurons or the presence of hormones that are released by specific glands and that travel and are distributed by the blood vessels. And an example of an electrical stimulus are the autorhythmic electrical signals that arise in the muscle tissue itself, as the ones seen in the heart's pacemaker. With regards to contractility, this is going to be the ability of the muscle to contract forcefully when adequately stimulated by an action potential. When a muscle contracts, it will then generate a tension, which is the force of contraction, while at the same time pulling on its attachment points. For there to be a movement of an object, the tension generated has to be great enough to overcome the resistance of the object to be moved. So if the tension is overcome, the muscle fibers will shorten and movement will occur. Next, we have extensibility, which is defined as the ability of a muscle to stretch without being damaged. And this will allow a muscle to contract forcefully even if it is already stretched. And this normally occurs with the smooth muscle of the stomach, for example, when it fills up with food. So this means that the stomach is already stretched and therefore the muscle is stretched as well. Therefore, the more you eat, the more your stomach wall will stretch to accommodate the food content. That's why when you go to an all-you-can-eat restaurant and you're impressed how much you're able to eat, that's because your stomach wall is able to stretch. Another example that is easy to understand is the filling up of the heart with blood during every cardiac cycle. So when the heart fills up with blood, the cardiac muscle stretches. Lastly, we have what we call elasticity, which, like the name says, is going to be the ability of the muscle to return to its original length and shape after it has contracted or extended. And this is accomplished due to the fact that it has elastic fibers within the muscle tissue. Through this sustained contraction or alternating contraction and relaxation, the muscular tissue is going to have 4 key functions: producing body movements, stabilizing body positions, storing and moving substances within the body, and also generating heat. With regards to producing body movement, the total body movements such as walking, running, and localized movements such as grasping a pencil, a keyboard, or raising your hand, they're definitely going to rely on this integrated functioning of the skeletal muscles, the bones, and the joints, which will all work together to perform this function. Next, with stabilizing body position, the skeletal muscle contractions, they're going to stabilize the joints and help maintain the body position, such as standing or sitting. And it's true that we have these postural muscles that are going to contract continuously when you are awake. For example, there's going to be this sustained contraction in the neck muscles that are going to hold your head up when you're listening right now to this anatomy lecture. This is why it is important to always try to keep a good posture. If you practice a good posture, you will be strengthening these postural muscles, and over time, you will have to do less of an effort to keep a right posture. And also, I don't know if you noticed, but if you are sitting down and you start falling asleep and you don't have a place to rest your head, then your head is going to be swinging to one side or the other because the postural muscles that are holding your neck up are now sort of getting relaxed because your whole body is relaxing. Next, we have the storing and moving substances within the body, which is done through this sustained contraction of a ring-like smooth muscle called the sphincter. And the sphincter will keep certain compartments closed and therefore prevent the outflow of the contents in these compartments to the next compartment. Sphincters are, for example, located at the end of the stomach, and therefore it will prevent the contents that are present in the stomach from moving to the next compartment, which is going to be the small intestine. In other words, this gastric content needs to be processed before it is ready to be absorbed by the small intestine. Therefore, until it is ready, it will stay in the stomach with the help of the sphincter, as it will close the entrance between the stomach and the small intestine. And that's where the function of extensibility that we saw on the previous slide comes in, because the muscles of your stomach are able to stretch to accommodate the food that's coming in without it being damaged. And last, we have the muscles that are going to contract. They release heat, and this process is called thermogenesis. This heat will be used to maintain the normal body temperature, which is around 37 degrees Celsius or around 98 degrees Fahrenheit. And when you're very cold and you start to shiver, this is to make your skeletal muscles contract to increase the rate of heat production until you're able to put on a sweater, for example. Luckily for us, here in South Florida, we don't have to do a lot of shivering.